It had only been 6 months since Maya Turner finally closed on her first home, and though the mortgage payment still tightened her chest every time it came due, the sense of permanence it brought made every sacrifice feel justified. Nestled near the end of a curved suburban cul-de-sac lined with modest single-story homes, her house was neither flashy nor particularly spacious, but to Maya it was more than enough. A quiet yard, a patch of grass, a short driveway where she could leave her weathered but reliable sedan. For someone who had spent over a decade renting and moving between shared units and basement apartments, the stillness of waking up in a place that belonged to her felt like emotional luxury. It wasn't status, it was grounding. She had fought for this life, not through courtroom drama or acts of rebellion, but through small, consistent choices. Savings, paperwork, solitude, patience. That was her path, and the moment the key turned in the front door on that first day, she told herself she would protect that peace at any cost. But Maya didn't live alone. Not really. There was also Meg, her aging Alaskan Malamute, who had accompanied her through 3 moves, 2 relationships, and a total knee reconstruction. Meg had a calm dignity about her, a kind of steady presence that Maya relied on in ways she didn't like to admit. When Maya came home from work exhausted and overwhelmed, Meg didn't demand energy. She simply sat close, breathing softly, as if absorbing the day's weight so Maya wouldn't have to carry it alone. They had grown older together, and now, after everything, they had landed here, in a house with real grass and a backyard that stretched further than any leash. For the first time, Meg had space to roam freely without the buzz of a city corner or the sharp pull of a leash redirecting her. It was Maya's quiet gift to the dog who had never left her side. The idea to build Meg a proper shelter didn't begin with grand intentions. It started with the realization that Meg's arthritis had worsened during the colder months, and that lying directly on the ground made her legs stiffen painfully. Maya consulted their longtime vet, who suggested a raised platform, gentle ramp access, and adequate insulation for joints. As someone who managed supply chain logistics for industrial hardware, Maya knew her way around material quotes and delivery lead times, and she approached the project with a blend of practicality and warmth. Within weeks, a cedar-framed shelter began to take shape on the south side of the yard, tucked under the natural shade of an old elm tree. She added foam-lined flooring, a shallow incline for easy entry, and even a green roof. Not for aesthetics, but to regulate temperature naturally. It wasn't flashy, it was functional. And more importantly, it allowed Meg to rest outside without pain. Neighbors occasionally glanced over with idle curiosity, but no one asked questions. A few even complimented the craftsmanship. Maya thought little of it. In her mind, building a safe space for an elderly dog wasn't controversial. It was kindness in action, something this world never seemed to have enough of. But on a dull Tuesday morning in early spring, she found a cream-colored envelope wedged into her mailbox, marked not with a postage stamp but with a return address she didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't the city. It wasn't the county. It was labeled simply, Neighborhood Association. Property Oversight Division. She opened it at the kitchen counter with a distracted hand, still holding Meg's leash in the other. Her eyes scanned the letter quickly, then again more slowly as the words began to settle, unwelcome and sharp. The language was dry, bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Unauthorized secondary structure of excessive dimensions, a violation of architectural guidelines, and a formal warning regarding permitted lot usage. The document even included a printed photo, grainy and clearly taken from the alleyway, showing Meg's shelter circled in red. The tone wasn't inquisitive, it was accusatory, and the final line made Maya pause entirely. Failure to remediate the non-compliant structure within 10 business days may result in further action, including the issuance of daily penalties. It felt absurd. This wasn't a shed or a studio. It was a dog shelter, custom-built for the health and comfort of a 14-year-old companion. It was smaller than the average children's playhouse and didn't obstruct any sight lines or encroach on any property lines. But as Maya read and reread the letter, it became increasingly clear that the complaint wasn't about logic. It was about control. Someone had decided that Meg's shelter didn't look right. And now a series of administrative steps had been triggered without her input, pushing her into a system of faceless decisions and codified consequences. Maya didn't act rashly. She didn't throw the letter away or storm into an office demanding answers. That wasn't her way. She scanned the document into a folder on her laptop, looked up the relevant bylaws, and sent a polite but direct inquiry to the listed email address asking for a clarification of the violation. 3 days passed with no reply. Then 5. On the 6th day, she received a response, short, impersonal, and unsigned, reiterating the initial claims and offering a pre-filled request for demolition extension form as her only recourse. No explanation. No avenue for discussion. Just a form to buy herself a few more days before she was expected to destroy the shelter she had built out of compassion. The injustice of it sat heavily on her chest, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the slow-burning frustration of someone who has played by the rules, only to be told that the rules can shift arbitrarily. Maya wasn't looking to pick a fight. She wasn't the kind of person who made scenes or launched neighborhood feuds over fences or parked cars, but something about this intrusion, this dismissal of what mattered to her, struck a nerve. Meg's house wasn't a structure on a blueprint. It was a promise. A small, quiet place that embodied years of loyalty, loss, and unspoken comfort. To tear it down because someone in a back office didn't like its shape. That wasn't oversight. That was pettiness disguised as procedure. For the next few nights, Maya sat outside in the backyard long after the sun had set, sipping tea with Meg resting quietly at her feet. The moon would rise, the air would cool, and she would stare at the little house they had built, thinking not just about compliance but about principle. She knew she had options. She could submit. She could compromise. But each time she considered it, the pit in her stomach deepened. This wasn't just about a shelter anymore. It was about the right to carve out space for kindness in a world increasingly hostile to nuance and care. And so Maya made a decision, not in anger, but in resolve. If the shelter for her dog was deemed excessive, she would build something even bigger, not to provoke, not to grandstand, but to make a statement that even the smallest acts of care deserve space. She wasn't going to fight them on their terms. Permits, definitions, enforcement. She would fight them with presence, with visibility, with action they couldn't easily reclassify or dismiss. And that is how the idea was born. To construct a log cabin not for people, but for the guests of her dog. A guest house in the purest sense. Not a rental, not a loophole. A quiet, standing testament to what it means to resist erasure not through protest, but through creation. She had no idea yet how far this decision would take her, how much deeper the conflict would go, or how many layers of resistance she would have to peel back. But she wasn't afraid. Not because she believed she would win, but because at her core, Maya understood something the letter writers didn't. When you build with purpose, when you act with care, you are already standing on stronger ground than anyone trying to take it away. Maya didn't take action immediately after deciding to build the cabin. It wasn't defiance for the sake of pride. It was preparation. She spent the next several evenings combing through county regulations and zoning maps, searching not for loopholes, but for boundaries. Where they began, where they ended, and where they had been bent before. The internet was saturated with contradictory forums and half-baked advice from disgruntled homeowners. But buried among the noise were clear state and municipal codes that outlined permitted accessory structures, animal enclosures, non-habitable units, and even recreational shelters. It wasn't a free-for-all, but it was also far from impossible. The key was scale, material, and classification. If she designed the cabin with removable foundation panels and avoided plumbing or HVAC, it could not legally be deemed a secondary dwelling. If she kept it under a specific square footage and respected distance requirements from the main structure in the fence line, it would fall under the category of non-inhabited recreational accessory. It was language designed for things like potting sheds, gazebos, even meditation spaces. Nothing said the inhabitants had to be human. Once the constraints were clear, Maya drafted a concept and emailed a reputable modular woodworker from a nearby town. She explained the design bluntly: a raised wooden structure with weather-treated logs, a small front deck, sloped roofing, and operable windows for airflow. She didn't explain that it was for dogs until the second call, and when she did, the man laughed softly, then said, "You wouldn't believe how many of these we've made for cats." They scheduled a delivery and partial assembly 3 weeks out. No permit was required. No concrete was to be poured. It was within every line she needed to stay inside. Meanwhile, the pressure outside was building. The silence from the association's office after she refused to sign the demolition extension was its own form of tension, the kind that doesn't explode, but waits. Neighbors began receiving phone calls and quiet visits from representatives who described Maya's property as under dispute. One older man from 2 doors down, a widower who usually nodded politely when he walked his spaniel past her gate, stopped, greeting her entirely. Another neighbor who once borrowed her ladder suddenly returned it without a word, almost embarrassed to make eye contact. Maya didn't blame them. When people are subtly told that someone nearby is breaking rules or being uncooperative, most will choose silence over conflict. The social temperature was shifting, not overtly, but unmistakably. She started to feel it in the grocery store, at the local post office, in the way people lingered slightly longer when driving past her home. Her name wasn't on any news bulletin, but the message had spread nonetheless. There's a woman on this street who won't follow the rules. Then came the second letter. This one was sent by certified mail, signed upon receipt, printed on heavier paper with legal formatting. It cited her refusal to comply with prior directives, labeled her non-response as adversarial, and outlined the possibility of formal litigation should her property continue to host unauthorized structures. The kicker, though, wasn't in the EAT letter itself, but in the list of attachments. One of the photos included wasn't of Meg's shelter or the yard. It was a shot of Maya herself, standing beside the structure, wearing a hoodie and jeans, her hand resting on Meg's back. It had been taken through the slats of the side fence. The quality was grainy, but the implication was sharp. Someone had gone onto her property. Not far, maybe only a few feet in from the sidewalk, but enough to photograph her without consent, then use the image as part of a legal threat. It wasn't just a paper warning anymore. It was personal. Maya took a breath, then took action. That same afternoon, she contacted a land use attorney recommended by a coworker. She didn't vent, didn't unload emotion. She sent scanned copies of the letters, her original shelter design, her research on permitted dimensions, and a PDF of the planned guest cabin. Within 2 days, she had an appointment. The attorney, a sharp, fast-speaking woman named Carmen, reviewed the material and said what Maya had been hoping to hear. "This is a scare tactic. You're not in violation of any code I've seen, and they know it. But that doesn't mean they'll stop." She advised Maya not to respond directly anymore. Everything would go through the firm. They would handle the correspondence, file a notice of representation, and document every new letter. "They want you to flinch," Carmen added. "We're not going to give them that satisfaction." As Maya left the office, she felt a shift inside. Not empowerment exactly, but steadiness. She didn't have to carry this on her shoulders alone. There were systems for dealing with threats like this. Legal ones, strategic ones. She wasn't going to march into meetings or deliver emotional speeches. She was going to follow process, one step at a time, until every inch of her yard was back under her own protection. Still, the emotional toll began to show. Meg started sleeping less, barking more. She'd rest beside the front door even when Maya was home, as if sensing something unsettled in the air. One evening, as Maya was taking trash bins to the curb, she saw a figure standing on the opposite sidewalk. A woman in a long beige coat, arms crossed. It was Karen Pierce. She had never introduced herself formally, but Maya recognized her from several community bulletins and her presence at neighborhood meetings. Karen gave a curt wave, more condescending than friendly, and then said loud enough to cross the street, "Still expanding your empire?" The sarcasm was thick, but Maya didn't rise to it. She simply turned, walked back up the driveway, and closed the gate behind her. She didn't need theatrics. She had lumber arriving next Thursday. Over the next 10 days, the backyard transformed. The prefabricated log panels arrived on a flatbed truck early in the morning, and the crew worked in tight synchrony. No wasted motion, no idle chatter. By the end of the second day, the guest house was fully assembled. It wasn't enormous, but it was unmistakably real. Clean, sharp lines, sealed windows, a tiny chimney purely for airflow aesthetics, and a placard on the side that read, "Guest Quarters." There was no mistaking its purpose, but there was also no legal grounds to demand its removal. Maya had even gone as far as documenting the entire build process in real time for insurance purposes, including time-stamped photos, receipts, and labor certifications. Everything was clean. Everything was compliant. On the third night after completion, Maya invited a friend from the local shelter to bring over 2 elderly dogs scheduled for short-term foster care. They stayed in the cabin for the weekend, quietly curled up in soft bedding under gently humming fans. Maya kept logs of their care, feeding times, and rest patterns, then included that report in a courtesy message to the shelter director, who expressed interest in expanding the concept. A pilot program, perhaps. Something sustainable. Kindness structured into process. She didn't announce this. She didn't post photos online or leave flyers around town. But somehow, the news traveled anyway. Within a week, the next formal notice arrived. Not demanding demolition this time, but citing possible misuse of property for unlicensed animal boarding or commercial activity. It was a new front, a different tactic. They weren't trying to remove the structure anymore. They were trying to criminalize what happened inside it. Maya brought the new notice to Carmen. The attorney sighed and began drafting a reply. "They're throwing darts now," she said. "They're hoping one sticks. They'll change the angle, the terminology, anything to reframe this as your wrongdoing. That means you're getting to them." Maya didn't feel triumphant, but she felt something clearer. The difference between being harassed and being hunted. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a campaign. And campaigns, unlike tantrums, could be documented, dismantled, and answered. One letter at a time. One structure at a time. One silent act of care, standing quietly in a backyard, refusing to disappear. The shift in tone wasn't dramatic or loud. It was subtle, gradual, the kind of escalation that begins in silence and spreads like cold air through a house at night. It began the way many bad things begin, with quiet compliance wrapped in cordiality. Within days of receiving the latest notice, accusing her of potential unlicensed animal activity, Maya found herself the subject of new forms of observation. A white sedan began parking across the street during daylight hours, never staying more than 20 minutes but always returning. Sometimes it arrived before dawn, other times near sunset. At first, Maya thought it belonged to one of the neighbors' guests, but when it started appearing twice a day and the driver remained seated, facing her property directly without exiting the vehicle, she knew it wasn't incidental. She started logging times and dates. The plates changed once, then twice, but the vehicle stayed the same. A simple white four-door, clean but unmarked, always idling with someone inside, sometimes male, sometimes female, always alone. At the same time, the calls began. Not to her directly, but to her workplace. At first, Maya's supervisor simply asked if she had been involved in any local disputes. The question was posed casually, under the guise of workplace gossip. But when the third-party logistics company that handled their regional contracts flagged her name in a cross-reference report, part of a routine background check due to new compliance standards, she realized this was no longer contained. Someone was feeding her name into systems where it didn't belong. She wasn't under investigation. There were no legal actions against her, but someone had begun pulling threads, testing how far they could go before she frayed. Maya requested a quiet meeting with HR, submitted a brief memo outlining the situation without overplaying it, and requested that any further calls referencing her personal address or property be reported immediately. The HR rep nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the seriousness behind Maya's tone. It wasn't panic, it was precision. Maya didn't dramatize, she documented. Then, just after the cabin's second week of operation, a yellow tag appeared stapled to her back fence, a public health alert, placed by the local sanitation department. The notice claimed her property had been identified as a potential biohazard risk due to excess animal presence and unmanaged waste accumulation. The wording was bureaucratic but inflammatory. Maya stared at it for a long time before removing it with gloved hands and sealing it in a plastic evidence sleeve. She hadn't yet had more than 2 dogs on the premises at any given time. All care was properly managed. Waste was collected in sealed bins, picked up twice a week through a private service that handled shelter-level cleaning requirements. She hadn't just been careful. She'd gone above and beyond standard hygiene expectations. The accusation wasn't just wrong. It was malicious. She called Carmen. Within 48 hours, her attorney filed an official request for inspection by a neutral third-party sanitation officer. They invited the department to conduct a full site review. The inspector arrived that Friday afternoon, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. He walked the property slowly, carefully, taking notes but saying little. Maya gave him space. She didn't defend, didn't explain. She simply unlocked the cabin, showed him the waste bins, and let the systems speak for themselves. An hour later, he left. 3 days after that, a signed clearance report arrived in the mail. No violations, no concerns. In fact, the report noted the property as maintained above residential standards for sanitation and odor control. Maya scanned it, forwarded it to Carmen, and placed the original in a folder labeled False Claims Resolved. But the pressure didn't stop. On the following Monday, she returned home to find her recycling bins overturned and contents deliberately scattered across the driveway. Not wind, not animals. The pattern was too specific. Broken glass positioned at odd angles. Newspaper pages deliberately unfurled and weighted with small rocks. The positioning looked almost staged. It wasn't the damage itself that bothered her. It was the performance, the implication that someone had been close, watching, acting with deliberate intent. Meg refused to leave the porch that night, growling at the gate twice around midnight. Maya stayed inside, lights off, hand near her phone. She didn't call the police. Not yet. Not without video evidence. But she began to consider the perimeter. By the end of that week, she had installed 2 additional motion-sensitive cameras, one facing the alley behind her yard, another angled toward the side fence. Both were discreet, high-resolution with cloud storage and real-time alerts. She didn't announce them, didn't post signs. Let whoever was watching believe they were still unseen. It was better that way. What Maya hadn't expected was the neighborhood meeting. A flyer appeared on her doorstep, hand-folded, anonymous, inviting all concerned residents to gather at the community park to discuss current zoning challenges and the preservation of visual harmony. The language was vague, but the timing was clear. She didn't attend. Carmen advised against it. But later, through a neighbor's teenage daughter who volunteered to dog walk for her, Maya learned that the meeting had centered almost entirely around her property. Karen Pierce had spoken at length about the slow breakdown of cohesion in the neighborhood, while other residents were encouraged to think about their property values and set an example for future homeowners. No direct accusations. Nothing libelous. But the implications were poisonous. Maya had become a symbol, not of defiance, but of disorder. In their eyes, she was destabilizing what they had worked to maintain, not because she broke a rule, but because she refused to be quietly corrected. It became harder to breathe in her own yard. The stairs lingered longer. The footsteps paused near her fence. The cars slowed as they passed, even when there was no stop sign. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the judgment had already been issued. She had stepped outside an unwritten line, and the community had responded not with debate, but with containment. Every silent glance, every closed conversation, every ignored wave. It was a verdict, and she was already living under its sentence. And yet, Maya refused to shrink. She began walking Meg more often, through the front gate, down the main sidewalk, through streets where she was plainly visible. She nodded to people even when they didn't nod back. She remained polite, composed, consistent. She wasn't trying to win them over. She was reminding them, and herself, that she wasn't going anywhere. Then came the most brazen act yet. One night, returning from a late shift and approaching her front steps, she found a torn envelope taped to her door, unmarked except for the single word scrawled in red marker. Remove it. Inside were printed images, grainy, low resolution, clearly, from a consumer-grade camera, showing various close-ups of the cabin's exterior. One photo had been taken through her kitchen window, from an angle that suggested the photographer had stood no more than 3 feet from her house. Her breath caught in her chest. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was intrusion. A breach not of legality, but of privacy, of her right to feel safe in her own space. She didn't hesitate. That night, she filed a report with the local sheriff's office, including the photos, envelope, and a signed affidavit of her previous notices. Carmen sent a formal cease and desist letter to the neighborhood's board, stating that Maya was now under active protection and that any further harassment, direct or indirect, would be met with civil litigation. The response came not in words, but in silence. The patrol car that had briefly begun passing her street twice a week now lingered at the intersection. The white sedan stopped appearing. The community flyers ceased. For the first time in weeks, Maya felt the air begin to cool again, not just in temperature, but in weight. Nothing had been resolved, not fully, but the escalation had exposed its hand. They had overreached, and now they knew she wasn't alone. Maya didn't celebrate. She reinforced her fence. She updated her cloud storage plan. She signed Meg up for a medical alert collar with GPS tracking. She contacted a local journalist, not to tell her story, but to quietly verify zoning law interpretations in her area, building a network, not a narrative. The battle had changed shape. It was no longer about a doghouse, a guest cabin, or even aesthetics. It was about power. Who had it, who was willing to abuse it, and who knew how to respond without becoming what they were resisting. Maya was learning, and they, for the first time, were learning that, too. By the 3rd week of formal legal representation and near-daily attempts to undermine her presence, Maya had stopped expecting clarity. She no longer looked for a single, dramatic turning point that would resolve the conflict or reveal the true motive behind the campaign against her. What she learned instead was that in situations like this, slow, bureaucratic, and fueled more by personal offense than lawful intent, escalation didn't arrive as a moment. It came in layers. It came in patterns. And sometimes it came dressed as something official and clean. The next major push didn't come in the form of threats or surveillance or passive-aggressive signage. It came in the form of a letterhead. A new envelope, this time with a logo she hadn't seen before, marked from the Department of Community Operations, Subdivision Compliance and Licensing Bureau. The envelope was larger than the others and included a printed packet of documents inside, each stamped and dated, each referencing an anonymous complaint that had now triggered a formal review of her property for potential unauthorized boarding activity in violation of commercial use zoning standards. She didn't panic. She read the document slowly, marking each section and its reference point, then called Carmen that same afternoon. The lawyer reviewed the letter in real time with Maya on speakerphone, flipping pages as she went. There was no formal charge. Not yet, just an investigation, an inquiry triggered by anonymous reports of animal care beyond residential intent. The citations referenced sections of local code that Maya had already reviewed months earlier, each carefully worded to allow wide interpretation depending on how aggressively they were enforced. Maya listened as Carmen sighed. This is strategic. They're no longer trying to claim you violated architectural guidelines or sanitation policies. They're trying to recast your intentions. They're suggesting you're running a business, even though you've taken no payment, filed no paperwork, and hosted only verified foster placements. It was clever, infuriatingly so, because in the eyes of a rigid code enforcer, intent could be twisted through semantics. Hosting dogs was no longer about care. It could be framed as commerce, a pattern of behavior, a use of property that, while technically legal under certain volumes, might be reframed if repeated too often. Maya knew they were bluffing, but Carmen reminded her, even a bluff can become a burden if it generates enough paper. So they prepared. Carmen submitted a counter-request for official zoning confirmation, asking the department to clarify the thresholds that would define non-commercial fostering under current law. At the same time, she sent a notarized affidavit from the shelter director verifying that Maya had received no payment, no compensation, and no public promotion of any animal services. It was clean, logical, preemptive. They weren't reacting. They were documenting. Every time the opposition tried to reframe her actions, Maya made sure to define them first, clearly and lawfully. Still, the inquiry gave her pause. She didn't want to be seen as skirting the edges of rules. That wasn't who she was. And so she took another step, not because she had to, but because she believed in removing ambiguity before someone else could exploit it. She met with the local shelter's volunteer coordinator and asked for a formal letter classifying her guest cabin as a remote fostering location under their current foster network agreement. The shelter director agreed immediately, even offering to schedule routine check-ins to solidify the legitimacy of the arrangement. Maya declined anything that would seem performative, but accepted the documentation. She scanned it, filed it, and forwarded a copy to Carmen. If they wanted a definition, she would give them one, and it wouldn't come from rumors or manipulated context. It would come from her. What Maya didn't anticipate was the sudden shift in social behavior. After the zoning inquiry began, Karen Pierce no longer lurked in shadows or stood across the street with feigned disapproval. She became oddly pleasant, smiling, offering short greetings when their paths crossed on morning walks. Her eyes, however, remained unreadable. There was something restrained in her face, something that made Maya feel she had stepped over a line that Karen now wanted to pretend didn't exist. It wasn't reconciliation. It was strategy, a pulling back just enough to make Maya doubt her next step, to confuse aggression with politeness, to invite second-guessing. But Maya didn't second-guess anymore. That had been drained from her. What replaced it wasn't paranoia. It was precision. She continued maintaining the cabin. She kept detailed notes on animal stays, scheduled them in cycles, avoided any overlap that might be seen as excessive. She had already adjusted the design to prevent any perception of human occupancy. No bedding larger than necessary for an animal, no food storage, no electric outlets that could suggest residential use. She'd even removed the decorative porch light, not because it was required, but because someone had commented that it made the structure look invitational. There was no invitation. There was only purpose. The halfway point in any battle is rarely clear. It's not the moment you gain ground or inflict damage. It's the moment you recognize the shape of your enemy, when all the masks and indirect methods give way to a steady, unified tactic. For Maya, that realization came when she reviewed the timeline. The letters, the staged trash, the altered accusations, the false sanitation report, the zoning inquiry, they weren't random. They followed a rhythm. They built upon each other. They weren't individual acts. They were a structure, a campaign, not orchestrated by coincidence or clumsy bureaucracy, but by someone willing to use every tool of governance as a weapon of pressure. It wasn't about a doghouse. It had never been. It was about control. Understanding this didn't change her course of action. It hardened it. It gave her reason not just to respond, but to prepare. She expanded her record-keeping. She bought a second external hard drive to mirror all security footage. She subscribed to a legal database to cross-reference citations in case new interpretations emerged. She reached out quietly to 2 other homeowners she'd heard had dealt with similar pressure and invited them for coffee. They declined, politely but firmly. She didn't push. Not everyone could afford to be visible. But their expressions, their hesitation, it was enough. She knew she wasn't alone. Not really. The midpoint, in hindsight, wasn't defined by a letter or a knock at the door. It was defined by Maya's shift from defense to design. She no longer waited for the next blow to arrive. She anticipated it. She built her steps accordingly. She moved forward with care, with documents, with proof. If they wanted to challenge her, they would have to go through walls of precision. They would have to reveal their intent not just through whispers, but through action. And when they did, she would be ready. Not because she sought conflict, but because she had learned how to stand through it without becoming the thing she fought. By the 5th week, the conflict ceased to be merely administrative. It had stopped being about boundaries on a map or ordinance citations in code books. It had become psychological, personal, measured not in documents but in proximity, in gestures, in the invisible tightening of space around her life. Maya began to notice it not in the noise but in the quiet, the way people hesitated before speaking to her, the subtle absence of invitations, the lowered voices when she passed. The campaign against her had evolved beyond the legal and structural. Now it was ambient, and its sharpest tools were not letters or notices but doubt and suspicion, woven silently into the fabric of daily life. It started with deliveries. Packages that previously arrived without issue were now marked undeliverable due to access issues. The mail carrier changed without explanation, and the new one left her parcels halfway inside the fence gate, as if reluctant to step fully onto the property. Then came the contractor cancellations. The seasonal roof inspection she had scheduled was abruptly postponed. First once, then twice, until the company finally claimed they were no longer servicing addresses flagged for code review. Maya had heard enough to recognize the euphemism. She contacted another company, this time using her friend Emily's name for the scheduling form. The quote came through without delay. It was clear. Her name now triggered avoidance. Contractors didn't want involvement. Neighbors didn't want association. Her address was quietly marked. Even the local animal shelter, previously eager to expand their fostering partnership, began to show signs of distance. Emails slowed. Scheduling grew difficult. The director, a well-meaning but overworked man named Carl, finally admitted that someone had submitted a request to the shelter's board to review all external fostering relationships for compliance integrity. The language was familiar, deliberately vague, but carrying enough weight to create hesitation. Carl apologized. It wasn't personal. He believed in her. But the board had to be careful. "They've made you look like a risk," he said. "They don't have to accuse you of anything directly. They just have to suggest it's easier not to work with you." Maya listened, thanked him, and hung up. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She understood. That was the game. Make someone radioactive not by action, but by insinuation. Not because of what they've done, but because of what they might represent. It was a form of social erosion, and it worked because it was quiet, consistent, and deniable. The turning point came when she found the tag on her car, a small strip of laminated paper tucked under her windshield wiper bearing no official logo. Just block text, "Animals and structures under investigation. Further development not advised." It wasn't a citation, it wasn't signed, but it was direct, unmistakably so. Maya stood by her car for nearly a minute, the tag in her hand, looking at the line of houses across the street. Curtains moved. Someone was watching. She knew it, not because she saw a face, but because the air around her had the weight of attention. Thick, pressing, intentional. That night, Maya didn't sleep. She lay on the couch beside Meg, who had taken to sleeping by the front door again, restless and alert. She reviewed every document, every photo, every scanned permit and clearance, making sure nothing had expired, nothing left unfiled. Then she opened a blank folder on her laptop, titled it Contingency, and began outlining a plan. It wasn't defeat, it was structure. If the pressure continued, if it deepened into legal terrain or criminal fabrication, she would need more than proof. She would need a full defensive map, legal escalation pathways, contacts in local media, a vetted list of attorneys who specialized in property rights litigation. She wasn't rushing into battle. She was building the scaffolding of resistance, quiet, methodical, without sentiment. 3 days later, the first formal complaint arrived. Not a notice, not an inquiry, but a legally formatted letter from the county review panel, stating that a petition had been submitted requesting emergency reassessment of her property due to persistent visual, acoustic, and sanitary disruption to neighboring households. The complaint listed no names, just signatures. 10, according to the summary. That was the number required to trigger a board review. Maya recognized 2 of the descriptions, references to a structure emitting glare at dusk and unregistered animal presence creating discomfort, both previously submitted by Karen Pierce under different forms. This time, however, the complaint had the backing of others. Maya's hands didn't tremble as she read it. Her breathing remained even, but something within her slowed. Not with fear, but with clarity. They were moving toward collective action now. They were attempting to create formalized pressure, layered in process, framed as democratic concern, and that meant they believed they could win. Not in court, not through enforcement, but through endurance, by drawing out the process until she bent or withdrew. They weren't looking for victory. They were waiting for attrition. She called Carmen, forwarded the document, and met with her that same afternoon. The lawyer's demeanor had shifted since their first meeting. Now she spoke not just as counsel, but as someone who had grown personally invested. "They're trying to institutionalize the harassment," she said. "This is how pressure gets normalized, when it's dressed as policy instead of hostility." They began drafting a rebuttal. Not just a denial, but a full counterstatement, itemizing each claim with supporting documentation, framing Maya not as violator, but as a community member under coordinated scrutiny. Carmen also submitted a public records request for the petition itself, including the names of those who signed. They had the right to know. Transparency, after all, was mutual. When the list arrived, Maya read each name. Some she expected. Karen, a man named Dwyer who had once scolded her for parking too close to his lawn. But others surprised her. People she had waved to, helped shovel driveways with, even exchanged plants with during spring swaps. Their names weren't malicious in print. They were quiet betrayals, small, cumulative reminders that politeness was not allegiance. It was often the preface to abandonment. Maya didn't confront them. She didn't call out names or send messages. She simply updated her security system, installed an outdoor mic array for ambient noise tracking, and requested that her next animal foster be picked up directly from the shelter rather than delivered. She reduced her physical visibility without reducing her presence. She walked the yard. She maintained the cabin. She waved to children who still smiled, even when their parents did not. But she also began recording everything. Daily logs, environmental readings, foot traffic near the property. Not because she planned to accuse, because she understood what was coming. The next escalation would not be external. It would be procedural. And she was right. A week later, Maya received a letter from the Regional Property Compliance Liaison Office, an administrative entity she hadn't even known existed, informing her that an anonymous report had triggered a review of her property's tax assessment. The letter stated that recent additions and modifications may have altered the property's value beyond previously filed declarations, and requested that she prepare to host an assessment agent within 30 days. This wasn't a fine. It wasn't a code violation. It was a financial pressure tactic. If they couldn't force her to dismantle the cabin, they would attempt to make it more expensive to keep it. Maya brought the letter to Carmen, who reviewed it and nodded grimly. This is textbook. They're bleeding you sideways, one administrative blade at a time. But Maya didn't flinch. She contacted her insurance agent, requested a valuation reevaluation, and asked for documentation showing the exact effect of the cabin on her premium. The increase was negligible, less than 1%. She submitted it along with previous assessments and a breakdown of maintenance costs. She scheduled the inspection. She left no room for speculation. What came next, however, was not another letter. It was sound. One evening, while preparing dinner, she heard a steady, low-frequency pulse outside. Not loud, not immediate, but persistent. She stepped outside. It wasn't coming from the street. It was coming from the property line. A speaker system, buried low behind Karen's hydrangeas, emitting sound barely audible to humans but unmistakable to animals. Meg recoiled instantly, ears twitching, body tense. Maya followed the vibration, found the source, and recorded the signal. She didn't touch it. She didn't disable it. She called Carmen. Then she called the sheriff. 2 deputies arrived within an hour. Maya showed them the device, the signal recording, and the effect on her dog. The device wasn't marked. It wasn't registered. But it was real. The deputies didn't take it, but they documented it. They filed a disturbance report. Carmen submitted a follow-up complaint. It was slow, it was quiet, but it was formal, and formal was power. Maya didn't ask for revenge. She asked for records, for chain of custody, for transparency, and in doing so, she forced every shadow act into the light. Not with confrontation, but with documentation. Her enemies hadn't changed their intent, but now their methods left fingerprints, and that changed everything. Because now the pressure had a shape, a name, and names could be answered, legally, strategically, permanently, and Maya, though tired, was ready, not to win, but to finish. to see this through with the same calm purpose she had started with. To prove, not through defiance but through detail, that presence is its own form of resistance, and that in a world of whispered pressure, clarity is revolution. It happened on a Sunday night, just after 11, when the world had finally grown still enough to feel like it might stay that way. Maya had just finished cleaning up after dinner, the guest cabin's exterior lights on a low timer, the backyard illuminated in a soft yellow that barely reached the far fence. Meg was already asleep by the back door, her breathing slow and heavy, comforted by the quiet. Maya stepped outside briefly with her tea, letting the cool air brush against her face, hoping it might clear away the migraine that had started behind her eyes earlier in the afternoon. The wind was still. The sky was clear. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt too quiet, not calm, but staged. She didn't see the fire immediately. It began as a glow, not at the structure's base but along the roof line, slow and deliberate, like someone had poured accelerant in a line and stepped back to wait. By the time the orange tongue of flame curled over the edge and licked at the sky, Maya had already dropped her mug, sprinting barefoot across the yard. She didn't scream. She didn't call out. She only ran. She flung open the cabin door, reached inside, and pulled the single foster dog, a senior Labrador with poor hearing and worse eyesight, into her arms, half carrying, half dragging him to the porch steps. The dog was confused, but not panicked. Maya wasn't confused. She knew exactly what this was. By the time she returned with the hose, the roof was gone. The walls, still damp from recent rain, slowed the blaze, but the fire had done its work. The damage was surgical, targeted to render the structure unusable without touching her home or neighboring yards. It was meant as a message. Not fury, not chaos, precision. Enough to avoid legal catastrophe. Not enough to avoid devastation. She called 911 with a hand that did not shake. Her voice was steady. She gave her name, her address, and then said simply, "Someone set fire to my animal shelter." The fire department arrived quickly, though by then there was little left to save. The remains of the cabin smoked and hissed, the logs charred through at their joints, the roof collapsed inward in a ragged triangle. Neighbors gathered at the sidewalk, not in concern, but in performance. Some with arms folded, some with phones out. Karen stood among them, wrapped in a pale robe, her mouth pressed into a thin line, offering no words. Maya didn't look at her. She didn't need to. The silence between them said more than anything either could have spoken aloud. The investigation began before sunrise. The responding officer, a tall young man named Reeves, took Maya's statement without skepticism, though he made no promises. She handed over her camera footage without waiting to be asked, flagged the timestamps she had already reviewed, and offered a printed copy of her recent harassment log, complete with formal correspondence, incident reports, and notations. The footage caught the act. A hooded figure, face obscured, had slipped through the gap in the far fence just after 10:30 p.m., walked straight to the rear wall of the cabin, and poured something from a metal canister along the seam of the roof before disappearing the way they came. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fast, it was deliberate, measured. The police didn't identify the arsonist that night, but the height, the posture, the route of entry. Maya knew what it suggested. Not Karen. Karen didn't move like that. This was someone younger, leaner, someone who'd been coached. She had seen Karen's nephew around the neighborhood recently. College-aged, quick to sneer, always pacing the sidewalk in half-visible loops like he was waiting to be seen but not recognized. She didn't accuse. She simply gave the footage, printed the stills, and let the police do their work. But she didn't stop there. By dawn, she was already contacting her insurance carrier, filing a property damage claim with evidence that all permits, designs, and uses had been previously cleared. She forwarded inspection reports, photos, blueprints, and foster partnership contracts. Everything was in order, Everything was documented. By noon, the adjuster had already scheduled a site visit. There would be compensation. There would be rebuilding. But none of that would erase what had been lost. The hardest moment wasn't watching the structure burn. It came the next day, when the shelter contacted her to cancel her upcoming placement. No blame was given. No accusation. Just a courteous message stating that, for safety reasons, they would be temporarily suspending off-site fostering until the investigation was complete. It wasn't anger that filled Maya. It was grief. Grief for the erosion of something she had built not out of ambition, but from care. Something that had stood for compassion, turned to ash not by accident, but by strategy. Carmen responded within hours. She drafted an injunction, filed notice of legal escalation, and submitted a civil claim for targeted property destruction. There would be a legal case. There would be depositions. And Maya would not withdraw. Not this time. Not after this. The board tried to distance themselves. They issued a public statement, not condemning the act, but framing it as an unfortunate incident unrelated to any formal community policy actions. No mention of Maya. No acknowledgement of the petitioned complaints, the tags, the anonymous letters. They wanted clean hands. They would not get them. Within days, the fire marshal's report confirmed accelerant use. The footage was cross-referenced with street surveillance, placing Karen's nephew within walking distance during the time of the incident. It wasn't a conviction, but it was enough for a summons, enough for Karen to retreat. She didn't appear on the sidewalk anymore. Her car stayed in the garage, and within a week, a moving truck pulled into her driveway. No announcement, no apology, just absence. But Maya didn't celebrate. She didn't speak to the neighbors. She didn't throw glances or seek validation. She walked her yard, checked the soil where the foundation had blackened, and began drafting new plans, not because she needed to rebuild, but because rebuilding was how she reclaimed presence, not to provoke, not to prove, but to persist. The climax wasn't the fire. It was everything that followed. The recognition that survival wasn't about retaliation, but restoration. That resilience didn't come from standing tall, but from standing again. And Maya, alone in her backyard with Meg at her side, stood quietly in the ruins of their cabin and saw not destruction, but confirmation. They had tried to erase her, and failed. The rebuilding didn't start immediately, not because Maya was hesitant, but because she wanted the soil to settle, the last of the ash to wash away on its own, the physical memory of what had burned to be cleansed naturally by time and rain. She didn't rush into construction or post images of the wreckage online. There was no tribute, no open letter to the neighborhood. Maya believed in private victories. Her resilience didn't need an audience. She knew what they had tried to do, not just to her property, but to her reputation, her community standing, her ability to move freely without suspicion. And she knew now, more than ever, that what they feared most wasn't confrontation. It was visibility, the kind that didn't bend or announce itself, the kind that simply refused to go away. The legal case against Karen's nephew advanced slowly but steadily. He denied involvement at first, claiming he had only been passing through the neighborhood. But the combination of time-stamped video footage, matching clothing, and an anonymous tip identifying the canister used in the arson tied him irreversibly to the event. Carmen, methodical as ever, pursued the civil case alongside the criminal investigation. She didn't press for media coverage. She didn't make speeches. She just gathered proof, issued statements, and prepared for the inevitable settlement. Maya watched the process unfold with the same clarity that had carried her through the worst of it. She wasn't vengeful. She didn't care about their guilt in the abstract. What mattered to her was documentation, precedent, closure. The insurance claim was honored in full. Within 6 weeks, Maya received a check that more than covered the materials for reconstruction. But she didn't use it right away. She waited, not out of fear, but out of control. The next structure would not be a reaction. It would be a statement of her terms, her timing. And when she finally met with the builder again, she brought a revised design. Slightly smaller, stronger in frame, fewer windows, steel-reinforced beams. And a new name etched above the doorframe. Not guest quarters, but still here. The structure went up in early fall, quiet and efficient. The construction crew worked without interruption. No flyers were handed out, no letters followed. The neighbors who had once signed the complaint avoided her altogether now, shuffling quickly past when they saw her in the driveway. Eyes lowered, conversation clipped. She didn't wave. She didn't provoke. She had learned that true accountability rarely came in apologies. It came in distance, the kind people impose on themselves when they know they've stood on the wrong side of something and don't have the courage to say so aloud. By winter, the shelter resumed placements. Not as frequently, not as publicly, but with a level of trust restored by time and consistency. Carl came himself to drop off the first new guest, a shy shepherd mix with a tremor in his back legs and a habit of hiding behind bushes. Maya knelt down beside him in the cabin, rubbed his ears, and felt the quiet come back. Not peace exactly, but something steadier. An understanding that the space she had made and defended still served its purpose. It wasn't about expansion. It wasn't about being right. It was about having a place where care was not subject to permission. In the final weeks of